Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a senior power platform specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation. And welcome everyone to this week's Friday session. This is, like I said, a continuation of the PL-200 multi-part series. This week we're going to be learning about low-code plugins. There's quite a lot to pack into this, so we do have a bit of a solid agenda. So that being, obviously, as usual, we start with the introduction. That's where we are now. But today we're going to be learning about what low-code plugins are, the different types of low-code plugins that we have available to us through Dataverse, how to create those low-code plugins, and then how to integrate those low-code plugins into things like Canvas apps and Power Automate. And we're also going to look at some of the common use cases for those low-code plugins. We'll then have our usual discussion session at the end where everybody's welcome to ask questions and kind of speak on their experience and kind of drive that forward. But before we launch straight into low-code plugins, we do always have our rules of engagement session. So essentially, this is just to outline kind of how we interact with these sessions. Um, the only thing is I tend to state is that if you have a question, please do ask it. We're all here to learn. I am a firm believer that there is no such thing as a stupid question. I have a 4-year-old daughter. She tests that assumption every day. We have yet to find a stupid question, and she does make an attempt. So please do ask it because we are all here to learn and we want to make sure that we get our answers. So, with that being said, we are going to launch straight into the topic itself, and we're going to start with what are low-code plugins. Well, low-code plugins are, in a sense, a way to use PowerFX logic to replace some of the work that we used to do in things like .NET coding and kind of some of the C# coding that we used to build plugins for. This was something that was implemented, I'd like to say recently. It feels like it was implemented recently, but it's been around for a little bit. But they're essentially designed to help centralize PowerFX logic and run it on demand or in response to a Dataverse table event. Um, so you can see on the screen that I've got that they are reusable and PowerFX based. Now, obviously, if you've done anything with Canvas apps, you'll know about PowerFX as it's the language that Canvas apps uses, so it's something we're familiar with. But the fact that this is reusable basically means that we can what this means is that we can create something using PowerFX and then reference it in things like Canvas apps and in flows to be able to perform actions with that PowerFX. And that's really, really powerful because one of the kind of common things that I find personally as a developer is I regularly am referring back to old applications that I've built and going, how did I do this function before? And actually, if I'm using it in multiple places at once, if I could put that into one function and just call that function, well, that's what essentially low-code plugins are. With them, we can achieve things that previously, like I said, would require .NET or C# coding, and they're generally used to solve two common problems that we face as developers. So this is, as I mentioned, PowerFX logic that is used across multiple apps. In this specific scenario, if we have a bit of logic that is used across multiple apps and we need to then update that logic, let's say it's for calculating exchange rates or you know, debt burdens, things like that. Um, if we had that logic implemented across, let's say, 5 different apps, and we decide we want to go and update that, we have to then update it in 5 different apps. Well, actually, with low-code plugins, kind of similar to environment variables, we update it in one place and it propagates out to everywhere where that's used, which means makes our lives a little bit easier from a maintenance perspective. But the other kind of common problem that this resolves is when you place your logic inside an application or flow that creates or updates a table row, the logic only runs when the application or flow creates or updates that table row. So we're talking specifically about Dataverse rows here. So let's say I have a bit of logic in an app that says, hey, when you go away and create, let's say, a row in the contacts table, I want you to go away and create 3 rows in the accounts table. We normally do that using, a patch function, a bit of PowerFX there. Well, actually, if someone builds a new application and that's supposed to happen every time the contact table is updated, and forgets to add that same logic, it obviously doesn't run. Consequently, your data isn't processed by a consistent set of rules, which means you end up with gaps in your data and things that are happening whereby we're expecting the system to create three account rows when we create a contact, but that's not happening because someone else has built something else. Well, actually, by creating one of the types of plugin we're going to look at today, you can set that to run on a very specific table event like you do for a normal plugin if you've ever dealt with them, such as when someone creates, updates, or deletes a row. In this situation of using that kind of plugin type that we're going to look at later, the logic always runs regardless of the application or the flow that creates or modifies the data. So it's moving that kind of that logic to, again, that data level that we've talked about previously when we were looking at I believe it was Dataverse in the very first session in this multi-part series. So that's essentially what low-code plugins are. They are a reusable set of powerful FX logic that we can either kind of centralize a lot of logic in one place, or have it set up so that this logic triggers when we create a Dataverse row or update a Dataverse row or delete a Dataverse row. And we're actually going to look at that a little bit later. So, what are the different types of low-code plugins? Well, there are actually two different types of low-code plugins, and again, we'll get to see this when we look at how we create them. These two different types of low-code plugins are the on-demand plugin. These on-demand plugins are only run when you call them from a Power Apps expression or a Power Automate flow step. Think of it very much like an instant triggered Power Automate flow, except it's slightly different. It's slightly better. We know that Power Automate flows are what we call asynchronous, which means we trigger them and then they take a few seconds to kind of actually run. Well, actually, with low-code plugins, especially the on-demand ones, these run immediately and give you the results very quickly. So they can run a lot quicker than your Power Automate kind of manually triggered flow could, and they can really help with that in terms of speed. Um, Alongside this, with on-demand flows, you're able to add parameters to the plugin to be able to pass information to them, again, like a manually triggered Power Automate. So when we think on demand, I tend to think it's like a Power Automate manually triggered flow. We can define inputs and outputs, and we can then call it wherever we need it. Except obviously in this case, this one runs a little bit quicker. It can run synchronously rather than asynchronously. And then we have the other type of low-code plugin, which is automated. Now, the automated low-code plugin is always tied to a specific Dataverse table and a row event in that table. So these are events like creating a row, updating a row, or deleting a row. Dataverse runs this plugin type when the event occurs, so it's not controlled by an application or flow. We're not really calling it from a specific flow or inside a Canvas app. Instead, what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, this always has to trigger whenever a row in this specific table is, is created, updated, or deleted, or one of those three, or any combination of those three. These type of low-code plugins only have one parameter, and that is the data row on which the event was triggered. So unlike the on-demand flows, and again, we'll see this when we look at creating them, they only take one input. So those are the two different types of low-code plugins and kind of how they differ. In terms of where we use them as well, we can quite distinctly see a difference there that the on-demand ones are kind of designed to be run inside a Power App Canvas app or a Power Automate flow, and the automated ones are where we are getting the kind of business logic in terms of PowerFX logic and behavior moved to the data layer in terms of the automated plugins, and that's kind of the benefit of them there. But as we all know, for us to be able to use these, we need to learn how to create them. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to run through and we're going to look at how we create an instant plugin, how we create an automated plugin, and how we then also use the connectors that are normally available to us in Power Platform inside that plugin. So very first thing we are going to do is we are going to look at how we create our plugins. So normally, obviously, when we come to make.powerapps.com, and I would like to just quickly call this out for anybody that's not aware, Power Apps has a new experience. You'll start to see things like the plans come up. We may cover this in a future session, but plans is going to become really, really useful and powerful later on, so keep an eye on this. But in terms of a plugin, the one thing we want to be able to do is get to the apps section on the left hand side from the home page of powerapps.com. And then we select all over here. And there's a very specific app that we're looking for called the Dataverse Accelerator app. If we press play on this, we end up in the Dataverse Accelerator app, and we should be greeted by two buttons, one saying create instant plugin and one saying create automated plugin. So this is where we create our plugins. And when you first come into the Dataverse Accelerator app, you'll notice that there's already two instant plugins created for you. There's a send in-app notification and send follow-up email. And any other instant plugins that you've created in the past will appear here. And if you switch it across to automated, there are no automated plugins created for you when you first open this app. So we've got these instant plugins prepped there, ready, created by the system for us to take a look at. And you can see here that I've created a instant plugin before. So now that we've come into the kind of Dataverse Accelerator, we want to create a plugin. So these are our two here. We've got Create Instant Plugin and we've got Create Automated Plugin. We're going to look at creating an instant plugin first. Now, you'll notice that we have the display name option up here. It is worthwhile noting that you should always make sure you have named your plugins kind of reasonably. So give it a name that makes sense, right? Make sure that it's clear what that plugin is looking to do, because what you're building here is reusable logic for yourself or other makers within this environment to be able to use and leverage to reuse that Power Effects code. So once we've given it a name, for specifically, this is where things start to be slightly different. For instant plugins, we then have to define our parameters. So we have here an input parameter and output parameters. Now this is important because actually our input and output parameters define what information we have to feed into our plugin, our instant plugin here, for it to work, and what information we want to get out of it. When we actually define our input parameters or our output parameters, we are given a list of data types. So you can see here we have integer, obviously this is for whole numbers. Decimal is for numbers with a decimal place. Float, Boolean being true and false, string being string, and entity reference. Now, entity reference is a slightly different data type. We know all the others, but the entity reference data type is used to pass the identifier of a Dataverse table row. When you choose this, you need to choose the table that you are going to be putting into here. So for instance, if I choose account, what this is going to be expecting as an input is the GUID of an account of a record in the account table. Okay, so when I look at the label here, I'm going to call this account record. Now you'll notice that when I've named my parameter, I haven't put a space in it. There is a reason for this. So this is because with input parameters, obviously they have to be passed values and they cannot have spaces in the names. It is worth noting that if you publish the plugin that you create and make a start using it and you decide to change either the name of a parameter or delete a parameter, or this is both for input and output, it can cause the maker solution to break. So I would advise making sure that you name your input parameters and output parameters as something you are happy to keep about. Because obviously as people start to use this, you're more likely to break other people's kind of solutions if they're making use of your low-code plugin. Now, when we look at the input parameters, you'll notice that unlike with manually triggered Power Automate flows, which we were using as a kind of a comparison point, we don't have the ability to make this kind of parameter optional. So when we're building our low-code plugins, we have to make sure that we are passing something into each parameter. Now, in terms of obviously defining our parameters, it is as simple as selecting the new input parameter, defining your parameter, and I'm just going to call this first name, middle name. Aha, see, there's me making the mistake already, putting spaces in, and last name. So we have our parameters there in terms of input. With output parameters, they look exactly the same. And there we go. And I'm going to give this a there we go. So we've defined our parameters. We're happy with them. We know what we want to be able to be put into the plugin, and we know what we want to get out of the plugin. So then we actually have to define the behavior of the plugin. So this is where things get a bit different. Obviously, I mentioned that this is Power Effects based. It's not 100% the same as Canvas apps. Okay, so in the case of this, if I want to define what my output parameter is, you can see I've just put in a curly brace there. It's now given me, in IntelliSense, my output parameter. We actually define our output parameters in the behavior here um, to you define them by setting them up as an inline record. So when we look at this, obviously I've got the output parameter of full name, and then I've got first name, middle name, last name. Well, actually, my output parameter needs to be defined here. So I'm putting that in as full name, and then I'm going to say concatenate. And then I actually want to reference my input parameters here. And actually referencing input parameters is a lot easier. You just type the name of the parameter. As you can see, sometimes it takes a while for the IntelliSense to keep up. Just be aware of that. There we go. And then that there. So there we go. I've defined what my behavior is. I've told this plugin that, hey, I want you to intake a first name, middle name, and last name, and you need to output that first name, middle name, and last name together as the full name output parameter here. So now that I've defined my behavior, I do also need to check the advanced options. So you can see here, you choose what solution your low-code plugin is going to go into. That is very important. We'll see why when we look at using connectors inside your plugin. Obviously, you get your name and you get description, but the really, really important one is this one down here, and this is the scope. So the scope matters because you can either have a global or an entity bound plugin. But what does that mean? Well, the global scope is the default. This is used when when the plugin you are creating isn't for a specific table. So in the instance of obviously a bit of reusable logic that takes first name, middle name, last name, well, that could be used anywhere. That could be used in a Canvas app, for instance, that records a person's first name, middle name, last name. It could be used, in Power Automate. It could be used anywhere, and we might put the full name in any table. So we're going to put this in as a global scope. The other one, which is entity, this one should be used when you want to get information about a record in Dataverse. If I were to choose that scope, for instance, entity here, I then have to choose a table that it's bound to. We're actually going to see an example of an entity bound plugin in a few minutes, but for now, we're going to leave that as global. But what entity allows us to do is essentially access the content of that Dataverse kind of table um, there. So once we've actually created our plugin, we hit save, and we wait for Power Platform to do its thing. There we go. You can see you got the option up here to test. Aha! First name is 0. That's because I have missed my data and I've left that as integer. Fix it, save it, test it. Now, obviously, if I published that, that meant that whoever's looking at that would then be trying to use the integer value, feeding in a text label, and this would have returned an error for them. So there we go. Run that. And great, there we go. It's told me, hey, there's the API call. That's the output there. William Jones Johnson right there. Perfect. So that's very simply how we create an instant plugin. There is a lot more you can do with the Power FX in terms of the behavior here. You can get it to do all sorts of things. We'll show some of them in a little bit. But when we're creating an instant plugin, obviously, we need to make sure a few key things. One, if you're referencing an output, make sure you're using an inline record setup. So that's a curly brace, and then IntelliSense will pick up your output parameters and then use the power effects to define that output parameter. Okay. When we're looking at the scope, if your plugin is only going to be working with one single table, it's not going to do anything else with any other table, you can use the empty scope, it'll work better. The global scope can be used pretty much anywhere. But that is creating an instant plugin. Now, automated plugins. These work slightly differently. So automated plugins, this one here, same thing, you have to choose a display name, but you have a table. So you have to choose a table that the actual automated plugin is going to run in. And as I said, these are bound to a Dataverse rows kind of event. So we've got created, updated, or deleted. I can choose that this plugin is going to trigger on all three. Same again, we define the behavior in the box here. And then we have advanced options. Now, obviously, this is slightly different to our advanced options that we have in an instant plugin. We have a choice of when this should run. So this is pre-operation and post-operation. And this actually does make a huge difference. So we're looking at when an item is created. Let's use that as an example. If I choose post-operation, what's going to happen is the record is going to be created in Dataverse. It's going to appear, and then this is going to run. In terms of the pre-operation, if I had had that selected, what we could do is someone goes, puts in all the information, and presses the save button. Before that save completes, if I've chosen pre-operation, my plugin would run. This becomes really powerful for when we're doing things like data validation, or we want to manipulate a record when they're first created. So let's say I have a contact record. I'm going to use the contact table because that's the one selected here. And let's say for some reason I've got a very specific regex expression that I need to check for in a specific column. And if the record doesn't meet that regex expression, I want it to basically turn around and not create the record. In that situation, I'd choose pre-operation. I'd define my behavior in here. So let's say if uh, we're gonna truly test here and hope. It used to be this record. There we are. If new record dot, let's say, let's go for, there's an email address too is match. He says, hoping that the email one is in here. Let's go with that. We then use the error function. There we go. Obviously, that's got an error there because it's expecting a match value instead. But in this situation, we'll look at it as if this was the email pattern in there. So we've basically said, hey, if email address 2 doesn't match an email, I want you to throw an error. Because it's set pre-operation and we've put an error in there, it's actually not going to create the record. So so this is really useful for when we want to do that data validation. You can also use it to prevent things like deletions and updates as well using that pattern there. But that's how we create an automated plugin and obviously some of the bits around when it should run. Again, we do have to choose a solution for it to embed into. Um, it makes sense, obviously, that it be put into a solution. Makes it easier. So we now need to obviously look at how we use connectors inside plugins. This is where things get very much different. Whereas before we'd be able to just call a specific connector inside of things like Canvas apps or inside Power Automate flows, plugins work slightly differently. And I'm actually going to close this tab down. So I'm going to look at, let's say, this one here, Automate plugin. So let's say when this is created, I want to be able to use, let's have a look at this, MSN weather. So here we go. We do get a warning when you try to do this. So to add a connector, you come up to the top right here, hit the connectors bit, and you'll get this warning saying if the connector you need is not listed below, create the connection reference in the maker portal and refresh the page. Now, if I look at this and I go MSN weather, and I go to connector and I choose MSN weather there, obviously I don't have a connection in there. This is where the solution we've chosen makes a big difference. So for us to be able to use a connector inside of a low-code plugin, the plugin has to be inside a solution. We then have to go to that specific solution, and then we have to include a connection reference for that specific connector. Uh, So now that's created inside of the solution that I have this specific plugin in. I can come across to here, hit that, and then we can go there. And I want to use the get current weather action. And there we go. I can now use that connector in there. So really important to note that if you want to use specific connectors within kind of your instant plugins and within your automated plugins, you have to create the connection reference inside the solution that your plugin currently is housed in first, and then you are able to use the connection reference. So make sure you remember that, otherwise you face a fair bit of frustration when the connector doesn't turn up. Now, coming on to actually this plugin specifically, obviously this is an instant plugin here. You can see that we're also able to do math in there. We're able to, using decimal places, do a few other bits as well. And this is a global plugin. We're actually going to see this plugin be used in a little bit. But in terms of actually creating low-code plugins, we're now able to obviously look at how we create an instant plugin. We've seen how we create an automated plugin, and we've seen how we use connectors inside of that plugin and how we might leverage it. Just some key tips from my side. When building instant plugins, obviously a lot of the times we're working with parameters. If you type a brace in an instant plugin definition, the IntelliSense will show you those output variables. However, if you're just typing normally, the IntelliSense picks up input variables rather than output variables. So really, really important to remember that kind of brace there to be able to define your output variables. Other thing worth noting is that you can't embed your output parameters within a logic tree. So if you write your plugin in such a way where you start it with an if statement and then you try to define output parameters inside that if statement, the output parameters will not work. So you end up having to define your output parameter and do the logic inside. So in the case of some of these plugins, a good example of this is, let's say I was defining some output parameter here and I put if and then let's go for housing debt or income is greater than 500. Then I want to define my output parameter, uh, let's say housing debt ratio. So that is not going to work. It's going to throw a fit about it. It's going to say, nope, we can't do that. Type mismatch, right? So right there, it's throwing a bit of a fit. Now, if I were to change that round and say uh, housing debt ratio, and say obviously that's going to throw a type mismatch, but writing it like that would work. Same outcome, differently written. There we go. It's just the way it expects to see it. We can't define our output variables inside of a logic tree. We have to basically build the logic tree inside the definition of the output parameter. Okay. And then one other thing, if you want to reference tables in your formula, it doesn't quite work quite the same as in Power Apps. Instead, you have to use the disambiguation reference. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that, that is an open square bracket, the at symbol, and then the name of the table, and then a closed square bracket. And alongside that as well, you can use multiple lines within your plugin, but they all have to end with a semicolon. So just be aware of that if you're trying to obviously format your code in a nice way. They do have to end with a semicolon. It becomes a bit messy. Okay, so we've obviously seen an example of how to create a low-code plugin, both instant and automated. I mentioned obviously that I have a instant plugin already in terms of the calculate debt ratio, and we need to now look at how we integrate those low-code plugins. So actually, when we're looking at integrating these low-code plugins, we need to look at three kind of instances. We don't really have to integrate automated plugins because they're already built into the actual table itself. So the Dataverse table, and they sit at that data layer. They are already integrated at the moment we create them. Okay. So what we need to look at when we actually integrate our low-code plugins is using global instant plugins in Canvas apps, using entity-bound instant plugins in Canvas apps, and using instant plugins in Power Automate. And this is relatively easy to do. So we're going to start with the using. Bear with me 1 second. Using global instant plugins in Canvas apps. And as you can see here, I've got a calculate depth ratio that is a global instant plugin. I'm going to come into my Canvas app. So you can see I've got a nice button here. Works really well. Actually, what I'm going to do, if I want to use a global instant plugin in Canvas app, I have to first add a data source. And the actual data source we need is the environment data source here. So you can see there, the environment table in Microsoft Dataverse. We click on that, and what that's going to do is that's going to load in, and it's actually going to give me access to all the global instant plugins that I have within the environment. So I can click on here, and if I remember correctly, the name of this is PNI calculate depth ratio. So there we go, environment.pni calculate depth ratio. So it's going to ask for the actual inputs as well. So it's going to ask for an income. So this one's going to be 5,000. Aha, he says. There we go, income, which is set to a decimal. And then housing debt, put that to 1,000. And then other debt, 500. There we go. So now if I insert a text label, and I'm going to set this to be total debt ratio as one of my outputs. So now when I press this button, you can see there I've got my debt ratio turned up. So that's obviously a very basic example of how we can use those plugins here. Let's say I had 15 different apps that all dealt with calculating debt ratio. Well, now all I have to do is call that plugin, and off we go. So that's how we use global instant plugins in Canvas apps. What happens if we have an entity-bound instant plugin? Well, relatively similar in that instead of adding the environment table, we add the table that the instant plugin is bound to, and then we reference it by basically, rather than doing where we've got environment dot, you would do, let's say it was bound to the contact table, you do contact dot and then the name of the plugin and then provide its inputs, and off you go. Okay, so using instant plugins from Power Apps, from Canvas, from Power Automate. So we have perform a bound action and perform an unbound action. These are the two actions or steps that we require in our flows to be able to use both the types of instant plugins where they are either global or whether they are entity bound. So if we want to use a global uh, low code plugin, we use the perform an unbound action. So you can see here my calculate debt ratio one. You can see it's then provided, hey, you need to give me an income, a housing debt, and another debt, which are the input parameters defined in the instant plugin. When we look at an unbound action, any we initially choose a table. One second. So let's go for contact. I think I still have a contact one on the contact. You then choose an action name. Now these will be, there we go, send email to confirmation to contact. So these are obviously local plugins, local plugins kind of put in there, and then essentially based upon that low code plugin selected, it'll ask you to obviously pop in a row ID, because when it comes to kind of entity bound ones, it's expecting a row ID to be passed in, and then it will add all your inputs in there, and then it will output. So if you've defined output parameters inside of your entity bound or your global bound low code plugins, the outputs of those plugins will then be available to you as dynamic content within that flow later on. So bear with me one moment. You can see there, after perform an unbound action, we've got, there we go, calculate debt response, total debt ratio, calculate debt ratio response, housing debt ratio, and then you get the response code as well. So that is how we integrate low code plugins with Canvas apps, both the entity bound and the global plugins, and how we use instant plugins from Power Automate, both those being entity or global. So, common use cases. Um, One of the most common things we see low-code plugins being used for is data validation prior to record creation. Now, I know that we have an element of this already present within Dataverse when we look at things like the URL columns that we can add, the email columns that we can add. But there are cases whereby we have to write a regex pattern, for instance, to run an ismatch function to be able to validate whether, I don't know, an account number is in a specific format. Low-code plugins can be used to do that, but prior to this, what used to happen is you'd have to define essentially a normal plugin through the use of C# or .NET. This makes it a lot easier to do that from a low-code perspective. You can also use them for creation of related rows on creation of another record. So one good use case I've seen of this is that when a client created an account record, they then went away and created a related SharePoint document location record because they were going away and creating essentially a document location for that user. Obviously, you can see their data validation based on custom patterns, so that's the regex piece. The bit around the prior to record creation means that, as I showed, we can stop records being created if they don't meet our data validation. The other thing as well is you can actually modify records prior to their actual creation in terms of using that pre-operation kind of create set up for an automated plugin, you could, let's say, trim off the leading and trailing spaces off of an email or a site address or things like that. You could also use it for removing special characters from, let's say, a URL. These are all things that are kind of common use cases for low-code plugins. So, with all that being said, our agenda for today was to obviously look at what low-code plugins are, as we've identified. These are a way to centralize PowerFX expressions and logic that is used in multiple places. And they make our lives as a developer a little bit easier. But alongside that, they can also perform a lot of additional functions in terms of prior to record creation data validation, prior to record update or delete data validation even, or even at the point of creating one record in one table, you may want a set of records to be created in another table every single time. Those automated plugins are really good for that. And the instant plugins are good for that reusability of code. We've seen that we have two different types in that we have instant and automated plugins. We have looked at what the difference between them is and where we might use them. We've seen how to create instant and automated plugins and how to use connections within those plugins. And then we've looked at how we use those low-code plugins that we have created in Canvas apps and in Model Driven and in Power Automate. We've also looked at some of the use cases. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.